This is Contra Zoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota Arsenault. Every once in a while, I like to have a chat with friends of the show, not about a specific movie or topic, but just to get to know them and their tastes a little bit better. I call these bonus episodes Better Know a Contributor. In the past, we've done them with co-host Rachel Ho and friends Pierre Frigon, Jeff Ballmer, Callum McNabb, and one where Rachel interviewed me, asking the same questions. On today's edition of the special, we have Paulo Bautista, who was last heard on episode 231, Best Films of 2022, where he sent in a voicemail about how Everything Everywhere All at Once was his favorite movie from last year. Paulo is the busiest podcaster I know. He has hosted shows like the Oscars Death Race podcast, Box Office Watch, yet another anime podcast, Filmography in Focus, and probably more that I'm forgetting. I really don't know how you do it all, considering I find programming and hosting this one show so time-consuming. But welcome back to the show, Paulo. How are you doing today?
Hey, Dakota. Doing well, and I will admit I've been a little bit lazy with the podcasting lately. We were just talking before the show. I was on a bit of on a vacation, visiting some family in Asia, going to a K-pop concert in LA, and of course, stopping by the Academy Museum. So I haven't actually put out an episode of any of my podcasts in like a month and a half or so, which is a little bit different. Hopefully I'll get back in the swing of things. I also just started a new job as well, so just gotta figure out how to balance it all again. But definitely looking to get back into the swing of podcasting.
Nice. Now, you were on the show before the Oscars happened, and we talked about some of the Oscar contenders this year. Overall, we haven't talked on podcast format. Obviously, we've chatted on Discord and places like that and social media since then, but we haven't really recapped the Oscars. Did you enjoy this year's Oscar season? How did your Death Race go this year? Was it a particularly difficult one, or one that you had fun with and was fairly easy to complete?
Yeah, no. So the Oscars Death Race season. So actually, I was during a period of fun employment I was having. So, you'd think that would give me more time to actually watch all the movies for the Death Race. I just ended up putting all of that time and effort into making skits for the Death Race this year, which basically left me I ended up falling behind on actually watching. So I had to kind of rush it in the last week. I did beat last year's record of finishing with, I think, with 7 minutes to spare. This year I finished with 11 minutes to spare. Of course, finishing on Diane Warren's, original song nominee, Tell It Like a Woman. So yeah, can't say I've gotten any better at finishing things in a timely manner, but still was able to finish. And of course, Everything Everywhere, like I said, kind of sweeping the awards this year definitely had me very happy.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah, you're a man who definitely likes to live dangerously with how close you cut it to the finish line there.
I wouldn't have it any other way.
Well, are you trying to keep up with movies released this year, ones that might be nominated? I know some people like to kind of keep tabs on all the potential nominees, and really it's so difficult to kind of predict what might be nominated. I know people love to try to do that, but I find it just kind of fool's errand. But other than just watching, new releases that sort of interest me, is that kind of how you go about your movie watching during the year before award season?
Yeah, so during the year, I don't really mind so much. I mean, I think it's more of a matter of efficiency for me, where when it comes to the Oscars Death Race, I generally will have an idea for what most likely will be Best Picture by the time I start the season. So I'll try to watch those in advance, right? But that usually, by the time of that TIFF rolls around, or Venice or any of the other film festivals, we kind of have a good idea of what will be in contention around that time. So it's not so hard to get the Best Picture nominees, and then I don't really try to watch literally everything to try to be done by day one, like Jeff or some others try to do. So, I'll usually during the year, actually. So one of the, I forget if you mentioned this in the intro. One of the podcasts I do is called the Box Office Watch podcast, where I try to keep watch on how much money movies are making and why. Again, haven't put out an episode since before my vacation, but that kind of suggests that I actually do like the good blockbuster here and there. So I recently watched Across the Spider-Verse, rather, really good one. I enjoyed Rise of the Beasts, Transformers that just came out recently. Have an eye on like Indiana Jones and so on, Mission Impossible, Joyride, kind of all the blockbuster hits that are coming out this year. I definitely have an eye on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as far as doing Oscar prep goes, usually as you were saying, by around the early fall film festival circuit, we know about probably about the 4 to 5 movies that are the serious players, and then the 15 to 25 movies that are probably the big contenders to be nominees across most of the categories.
Yeah, and then other than that, I mean, I try to do stuff on the side, like I'm supposedly in the off season, haven't I've again been delayed on this episode, but I try in the off season to go back and watch the Best Picture winners throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm setting a goal to try to watch all 100 Best Picture winners by the 100th Oscar ceremony, so in like 5 years or so. So I have a little bit of time, but I'm going to be going through and trying to get through some of those. The Academy Museum gave me some real good inspiration for what I want to be watching, coming up. And then also, I'm also in the Magic the Gathering. So there's a new set coming out this year, actually, just released about Lord of the Rings. It's a crossover with Magic the Gathering, which has got me itching to go and watch the original trilogy extended edition. So
nice.
Yeah, that's some stuff I have kind of planning out. And then of course, the anime stuff for the anime podcast, trying to keep up with the seasonal shows as well. So that's kind of like my TV that I watch.
Nice. Yeah, it took me, I'm trying to remember how long it took me to watch all the Best Picture winners, and I think it was about 5 or 6 years. That was a good portion of the early history of this podcast, was just kind of going through and going decade by decade. And so it really helped having the podcast to kind of keep me on track, and not that I had specific episode dates of when I want to do it, but just an ongoing project. And I think the same will sort of happen with you. I know I was a fan of the episodes that you had started to do on the Oscars Death Race podcast when you were kind of periodically picking a few movies and doing theme topics, and you showed your whole spreadsheet of how you're kind of connecting the episodes. And I really liked what you were doing there, and I look forward to you picking that back up and continuing, because it was a really fun series, and I think you did some really interesting pairings and groupings that way.
Yeah, definitely looking to get forward to that. And, around the times that TIFF, a little bit after when TIFF comes out, I'll definitely have an episode later this year, kind of just recapping of who the main players were from TIFF and who to keep an eye out for in the fall season, so to speak. For the Box Office Watch podcast, I think of the year in kind of thirds. January through April is kind of like, the early season. Not a lot of movies coming out, and, maybe a bit of a dumping ground, but you do have a couple of gems there. Also Sundance, of course, summer season, of course, and then the fall winter season. So definitely a lot to look forward to. I think in particular this year, I'm probably most excited for the animated race. Of course, Across the Spider-Verse is super exciting, but there's not for a lack of other great films coming out this year as well. But that's a topic for another episode.
I basically have you and John Richards from Red Carpet Rosters to look forward to as my gurus, because the two of you are so great at analyzing the data, and from very different and interesting standpoints. You with your box office sort of way of looking at things, and John using sort of statistical analysis as far as who's winning awards at the different festivals and award circuits and things like that, and kind of using the models he's using to predict who's going to win or be nominated. So between the two of you, I feel like if you put your heads together, you could probably create a perfect Oscar ballot every year.
I don't know how well we did this year, but I mean, I will say in my day job, right? I mentioned I got a new job. I mean, I work, kind of when not doing movie stuff I work in the advertising technology industry, as a revenue operations manager. So it is my day job to like look at numbers and spreadsheets, and, somehow I'm not tired of it after work. So that's why I like looking at the numbers for box office or other things, kind of otherwise, and trend and historical trends. That's kind of like my bread and butter.
Nice. Yeah. And you're really good at it too. So if anyone hasn't been subscribing to the Oscars Death Race podcast or the Box Office Watch podcast, you do a really great job of both breaking it down very intelligently, but also simplifying the numbers. So that way, someone who maybe is not as much in the know, someone like me, it's easy to digest and understand.
All right. I appreciate that, Dakota.
Of course. So yeah, let's get into this. The topic today is getting to know you. And so if you've listened to these other episodes in the past, I'm going to link to some of them in the show notes. I have 10 questions that I'm going to ask all of my favorite contributors. Paulo was just the latest in the long run of great friends of this show that I'm very happy and excited to have on. So without further ado, let's get started. And the very first question is, how many episodes of Contra Zoom Pod have you been on?
I think you sent this to me. I actually, I did. I think it was 7. Correct. Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, you have been a longtime member of this show, going all the way back to episode 100, which is a pretty cool milestone for me to have you on, and I'm pulling up the information now of when that was, because I feel like
that was
ago.
probably right. That was right after the 2020, right before the pandemic happened, right after the 2020 Oscars. Because I remember I had actually got it. So I technically had another podcast before, right, from my my school's alumni association, which went on hiatus and then came back afterwards. But the first time I really did a podcast for myself really was this Oscars Death Race podcast. I gotten really into, so a little bit about, I guess, my background in watching movies. I, obviously grew up, I didn't grow up really watching movies, mostly animated Disney stuff, right? Kind of like a typical Asian kid. Didn't really have a lot of free time in my spare time. If I had free time, it was mostly spent studying. So it wasn't really until after I graduated. I mean, I knew of culture, pop culture and movies kind of like tangentially. Obviously I'd seen like Star Wars and some other basic stuff, but there's a lot of my film history gap, which we'll talk about later. But mostly animated stuff. And then when I moved out to New York, right, maybe a couple of years after getting settled in the city, I started really keeping track of movies by around, I think, 2016. And I think the first film I really watched intentionally and started keeping track of all the movies I watched each year was Martin Scorsese's Silence, actually, with Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver. So that was like my first intentional movie I really watched and started logging before even I had a letterbox. I would carry like a notebook around with me and just log what I was watching every time I went out to the movies. And my goal was to get to 100 movies each year. I didn't hit it for a couple of years. I have for the I think 2 years ago, but Parasite was actually, and then I started watching kind of like the best picture winners. I think maybe like 2017 or 2018. I definitely watched it around for the Shape of Water best picture. And then 2019, I was really into, by that point, really into watching movies. And Parasite was just kind of like, Parasite Mania was just sweeping, I guess, both the Asian American community and also like the film community. And that was what, I really want to see, I want to say Parasite, I wanted to win, but for myself, I felt I couldn't say it deserved to win unless I had seen everything else. And so that's how I kind of discovered the Oscars Death Race phenomenon. And from there, I started posting on the Oscars Death Race subreddit. And then you, Dakota, were actually one of the first people to comment on my episodes on Reddit, and very encouraging, which encouraged me to keep going. So when you invited me to come on at the end of the season, I was more than honored to, because really, I don't think I would have gotten into doing all of my other podcasts if not for your encouragement. So thank you for that.
Oh, wow. You should not be thanking me. Your excellent work sort of speaks for itself. And I'm just happy that we've ended up becoming friends over the years.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, that was very exciting. I do remember doing that interview and sort of the impetus of wanting to have you on, and just finally having another Death Race friend, sort of, so to speak, I guess is the best way to put it. But of those 7 appearances, do you have a favorite guest appearance that you've done?
Yeah, so I couldn't narrow it down to one. It was between, I think, my two, because so every year you do the episode where you bring us on to talk about two or three Best Picture nominees, and so the past 2 years, the past couple of years we've done it. 1 year was the Sound of Music Minari Nomadland episode, and then last year's Everything Everywhere All at Once Elvis, and then Woman Talking. And I think part of that was that both of these episodes included my favorite films of each year, Minari and Everything Everywhere, and so just having license to just go on and talk about how great these films were definitely really great. If I'm not, I forget who. I think it was Jeff was our co-guest on the Minari episode, if I'm not mistaken. I know last year was with John from Red Carpet Roster, so it's definitely fun getting kind of bouncing off each other, kind of fanboying about our favorite films.
Yeah, I will reveal something here, and that is, you usually get first pick of which Best Picture winner nominees you want to cover, because every year I've had you on to do this series, and you usually reach out to me like, hey, if this one's available, I'd love to do it. And so I usually work around your request in that sense, because there is a bit of math as far as trying to even out the episodes in terms of runtime. And so that will be something like the 2 movies that have the most nominations are split up, and then ones with lesser nominations are kind of added.
I mean, that's, what they say, the early bird catches the worm. So when there's a movie I know I want, I'm definitely going to bug you about it. Just like how you're definitely going to bring me on for the Everything Everywhere All at Once retrospective for A24 in a couple of years, right?
We'll have to see about that. I feel like that's going to be a very popular
Hey, I'm
episode.
putting my name out. I'm manifesting it this early. So, I'm getting a head start.
It sounds good. I'll have to make a mental note of that and add it to the list of I think about 4 or 5 other people that have also kind of mentioned it. And I'm sure next year or later this year when the Oscar nominations come out, I guess that will be early next year, you'll probably be the first person to reach out to me and be like, hey, this one's on my radar. And I don't have to worry about Jeff because Jeff sees everything, as you said, by day one anyway. So it's not like I have to worry too much about him having not seen anything.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So now we're going to get into more of your personal taste. And I want to know, what's your favorite movie of all time?
It's hard to pick, right? I think like because like similar in the way I have so many different podcasts, and for me, my podcasting is a way to kind of get to like explore the different parts of what I enjoy. So like, I have a podcast about playing Magic the Gathering. I have a podcast about anime, about looking at revenue reports for box office numbers, and then of course for the Oscars death rate. So kind of a little bit of different everything. So in that sense, my Letterboxd top 4 I think is a pretty good indication. Right now, my number 1 film is Everything Everywhere, and that's not just recency bias. I will say I think Everything Everywhere really did fundamentally change the way I look at the world. Right, on top of being like a great Asian American story out there. And then, we have Parasite, again, another kind of the film that really got me into this whole death racing thing. But also, right, I think it's just one of the most genre-bending, mind-melting films out there. And then let's see. I also have Your Name, the Makoto Shinkai film, which, I don't know if it's the greatest anime film out there ever, but it is, I think, my personal favorite. And then I also have the Guardians of the Galaxy on there, which, if I'm honest, I probably like Guardians of the Galaxy 2 a little bit. Well, I think I like Guardians of the Galaxy 2 a little bit better. But it feels weird for me to put Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and not over the first one. So and that's kind of like representing my big blockbuster films that I like. And, one fun thing about all of these films is these are like, I very rarely actually go back. I very rarely double watch films just because in my mind, there's just so much content out there, so much movies, so much anime out there. I very rarely will go back and watch a piece of media twice. I have gone back and watched all of these films at least 3 times, which kind of indicates how much they mean to me.
Yeah, you're very similar to me in that regard. That's something that Rachel always teases me about, where like if I've watched a movie, I go, okay, well, I'm good for, the next 4 or 5 years. I don't need to see it again, if not longer.
Yeah, I mean, I'll make an exception, right? It's like I mentioned, I had films that obviously I had watched before 2016 when I with Silence. So especially like animated films growing up as a kid. Like if I had to pick one of my favorite Disney movies growing up, I'd probably say the Goofy movie actually, because that was like an endless nostalgia thing for me, going on road trips and watching that with my siblings. But yeah, I mean, I'll definitely go back, I think, at some point, and because I haven't logged the films from like before, I want to say 2012. I wasn't watching a lot of movies while I was in college because, of course, college. But before 2012, when I was still living, or before 2010, when I was like still living at home, I wasn't really keeping track of what movies I watched. So I haven't really logged any of my childhood movies growing up. So I'll have to get back around to doing that. At some point, I'll probably rewatch them for that. At some point, who knows? I might do a Disney rewatch podcast at some point and kind of watch and contextualize all of the Disney movies out there. But yeah, I mean, as far as my favorite films, right? Everything Everywhere, Parasite, Your Name, Guardians of the Galaxy are kind of emblematic of who I am as a film watcher.
Nice. Those are great picks. Yeah, as far as what I've kind of done in my pre-Letterboxd era is like if I see a movie pop up, because I'll occasionally just go in a rabbit hole on Letterboxd of clicking directors or actors, and if I see something I'm like, oh yeah, I did watch that as a kid, I've seen it before, I'll just click watch. I won't say that when I logged it or give a review or a star rating. I just simply mark it as I'd seen it before.
Yeah, that's the thing. I want to put a star rating, but I can't do that until I've noted the date that I watched it, which is annoying. So
yeah. I'm the same way. Yeah. All right. So the next question. Now, this one's going to be interesting because I've given you a lot of gruff over the years for having not really seen many Wes Anderson movies. You actually, I recently made a comment on an episode saying that you had never seen any, and you would reply to me saying, actually, I've seen his 2 animated films. But what is a movie you're embarrassed to say you've never seen? And you don't have to say a Wes Anderson movie just to please me.
Dakota, is this a safe space?
It is. It's a very safe space.
Will our friendship last after this question?
Yeah, you know what? No one's really going to listen to this episode. I'm just going to publish it to the world, and yeah, no one will listen to it. You're good. Right. You're good.
So of all the questions that you gave me to prep for this one, I have the longest preparation for, actually. I'm not going to just give you one movie I haven't watched. So I already mentioned, right, like of the best pictures, I actually haven't watched a lot of them. I looked at the numbers. I've only watched 19 of the 95 best pictures. However, 16 of those were either for this podcast or I had somehow watched beforehand. So, or 16 of which were for the podcast. So only 3 of which I had watched at some point in time beforehand. At the AFI top 100 films of all time, I've only watched 17 of 100. Yeah, I mean, it is like, again, I definitely did not. And then, so I obviously there's the film nerd side of me that says I should be watching more of this stuff, right? So, just naming out some directors and actors, Francis Ford Coppola, right? Apocalypse Now or Godfather, Wes Anderson, as we mentioned, we actually have a bet right now in the Discord, based on the box office of Asteroid City. If it hits above or below a certain point, I'll have to watch all of the Wes Anderson films this year, actually. Being someone who loves anime and Japanese films, I haven't watched much Kurosawa. I haven't watched much Wong Kar-wai, much of Scorsese. I've obviously watched a lot of Spielberg. I did an episode of my old podcast, Filmography and Focus, on up through the 80s, but there's a good bit of his sci-fi period I haven't seen. Haven't watched anything of Jordan Peele's, actually. None of the Coen brothers. Only 2 of Stanley Kubrick films. 3 of Tarantino's films. Nick Cage. And then, some franchises I haven't watched much of. I haven't watched any Bond film except for the one for the Death Race a couple years, last year, I think, or a couple years ago. Haven't watched any Ocean's 11. Any of the classic horror films like Chainsaw Massacre, Final Destination, Elm Street. Haven't watched the 22 Jump Street. Like I mentioned, I haven't watched the extended Lord of the Rings version. Funnily enough, I watched the third movie, the Return of the King, on a field trip, I think in like middle school. I had not seen the first 2 films, actually. So I was very confused what was going on. For going to school in Philly, I haven't seen the Rocky movie. Haven't watched any of the 80s or 90s Batman's films. Any of the classic comedies like Airplane or Naked Gun, Monty Python, Masaki Yuasa films, and kind of like those 80s and 90s pop culture films like Office Space, 9 to 5, The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, RoboCop. A lot of kung fu classics I haven't watched: Jackie Chan, Jet Li, Bruce Lee, even Ang Lee's Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Animated wise, I'm mostly okay, though I will say I've missed out on a couple of the Kung Fu Panda films, and notably haven't watched Coraline yet. Anime films, I still have to watch the Evangelion films. Haven't watched the Rocky Horror Picture Show or the Truman Show, Pan's Labyrinth, Braveheart, Groundhog Day, Big Lebowski, and kind of probably one of my biggest sayings is, for someone who's really involved in the Asian American community and really interested in Asian American topics, I actually haven't seen Better Luck Tomorrow or Joy Luck Club, actually. So yeah, that is a long list of things that I have not watched that I have been meaning to watch, but there's only so much time in a day, man. So yeah, hopefully you can still be friends after this.
Wow. Okay, that was quite the answer and not what I was expecting at all. I spent just about every other movie you just mentioned just like blinking rapidly, trying to digest what you're saying. I will say it like this. I have come to the understanding and the Zen-like state that, in the past, I feel like I would judge people like, oh, you haven't seen that? Oh, what's wrong with you? Sort of thing. But then it's sort of I've seen people word it when like someone would say, oh, I haven't seen that yet. The response is usually, I'm excited for you. Yeah. Because you get to experience it. And I've sort of adopted that mantra myself. And all those amazing movies and franchises and directors and time periods and genres that you just mentioned that you haven't seen, that you feel like you should have seen by now, all I can say is, if you ever do get to them, you're in for a fun time. Like you're literally, that's the good thing about movie watching and this sort of stuff that we do, where we try to watch as much as we can, is it's going to be fun. It's going to enrich you. It's going to make you feel happy and feel emotions and think and all this great stuff. And so you might have named a really big list, and I might have been super shocked by all the titles you just said, but I'm excited for you.
Yeah, and there's a webcomic XKCD that kind of has a similar episode, a comic that has a similar episode, like, you're one of today's lucky 10,000 to discover something, right? So that's something that I'm, and it's not like I don't know anything about these films, but I've been around the film, I guess, film conversation long enough that I understand these pictures and kind of like their place in film history and kind of like the theoretical. I know it's obviously very different to experience for yourself, right? But that doesn't mean I can't appreciate kind of like the contextual historical relevance of these films, right? So that's something. And the other kind of way that I'm kind of like made peace with where I am in terms of like what I haven't seen it is, like I said, I didn't really watch seriously thinking about watching movies until like maybe like 5 to 7 years ago, right? And obviously I was working full time, and I have all these other hobbies I'm involved with as well. So it's not like I'm a full time movie nerd, right? I have other stuff going on. So given that it's only I'm functionally like a 7-year-old in terms of movie age, I think that what I've done so far isn't that bad. So I will say just to leave it on a bit of a less of a shocking, well, I don't know if it's more or less shocking, but kind of like a optimistic note. Here are a couple of films I actually have recently in probably the last year or so have finally gotten around to watching. So finally watched Mean Girls for the first time. Finally watched The Princess Bride for the first time. I watched all of the Muppets movies for the first time, aside from the 2015 one. And then I watched Avatar for the first time, which I know mixed feelings on Avatar, but still. And then watched Who Framed Roger Rabbit for the first time. And then this will probably lead into your next question, but I watched all of the films of Satoshi Kon for the first time. So, that finally was able to get those monkeys off my back, so to speak.
There you go. And like the movies you just named, I've seen most of them. It's like those are all so fun movies that you could have watched, and I'm so happy that you got to experience them and probably get a lot of joy out of it too.
Yeah, I think part of it is that I'm a very systematic person, if you couldn't tell, right? Like I have this whole spreadsheet for the Oscars death race, right? I have like this spreadsheet for the best picture films I want to be watching. So for me, I find it very difficult to just like plop down and say, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and watch this random film this day, right? Like I have to have like a plan of action to go for it. So that's why when I was doing, filmography and focus for a while back before I didn't have time to continue it, it's like, all right, I'm going to pick one director and watch all of their films in this given month. And that gives me a direction to watch all of them. So like, again, I watched like Spielberg's films that way. I watched Bong Joon-ho's films that way, watched David Fincher's films that way. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of like for me, a more systematic way to go about movie watching, which, helps me contextualize these films in a larger landscape, so to speak.
Yeah, we're definitely a little similar in that point as well. But like you said, you sort of led into the next question, and I'm very curious to hear it now and sort of break that down a bit. But who is your favorite director?
Yeah, so going by my Letterboxd, I looked up kind of like which films I had rated the highest, which directors I'd rated the highest. And the director that came up as the highest rated was Satoshi Kon for me. Given that I had seen his entire filmography, which is sadly very short, right? Died very young of, I believe, pancreatic cancer. But he did these amazing films where I've given every film of his a 5 out of 5. Perfect Blue, Millennium Actress, Paprika, Tokyo Godfathers, right? Like these are films that have influenced, the likes of Chris Nolan or Darren Aronofsky, right? And they are, I think, perfectly constructed films that play with the medium of animation. It's not just because like I'm a big anime. I mean, obviously, me being an anime fan is a big part of it, but just like the fact that he was able to have such a visionary approach to playing with animation as a medium, kind of in the same way that Guillermo del Toro has been keeps talking about, right? Like the animation is not a genre; it's a medium to do things, and you can do things you can't do in real life. Like he's one of the directors I think has taken that to the fullest. It's again a tragedy who's taking us from so young. It'd be crazy to imagine what he'd be up to if he was still alive today. But he's probably my favorite director just off of quality alone. Like I can't think of another director whose entire filmography I've given a perfect 5 out of 5 to.
Wow. Yeah. I've only seen Paprika from him, and like watching that, like you said, the influence on Christopher Nolan, especially Inception, is really high, and you can absolutely see where Kon's influence is on live action directors as well, trying to translate his sort of very dreamlike atmosphere into making it into reality.
If you want a recommendation for Satoshi Kon, I would say that his film Tokyo Godfathers is probably the perfect Christmas movie, actually. So that would probably be something I recommend you watch around Christmas time.
That sounds good to me. All right. So you mentioned it earlier. You have seen 19 Best Picture winners, and that sort of leads into the next two questions. The first one of which, of the 19 that you've seen, what is your favorite one that has ever won Best Picture?
I mean, given that two of my, like when I mentioned what my favorite films of all times were, two of them were Everything Everywhere and Parasite. I mean, that's probably the easy answer to give there. So I'll probably stick with that for now.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any others that sort of are pretty highly ranked for you that are not those two?
You know, I actually, when I was younger, like in high school, I saw Slumdog Millionaire. I really enjoyed that. I probably need to go back and rewatch it with a little bit more mature film eyes. But from what I remember, seeing it as a youngster, that's something that I definitely enjoyed watching. Shape of Water also I think is probably up there as well. Just because Guillermo del Toro, I don't think can do anything wrong really. So definitely looking forward to going back to see Pan's Labyrinth whenever I can get a chance there.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, those are some really good picks. Now on the flip side of the coin, what is your least favorite Best Picture winner that you've seen so far?
Yeah, probably Titanic, honestly. I mean, again, respect to James Cameron for doing it practical and all of that. It's just excessively long, and I just I think I've come to terms, talking with John and Red Carpet Robsters and others on, the story is crap, but that the story being crap allows for the larger special effects to stun and wow you more, kind of, in a similar way that Avatar does to some degree. But yeah, I mean, it's either Titanic or I don't know, Forrest Gump might be down there. I know it's kind of a classic for a lot of people, but again, this is to say I haven't watched any of the really, really bad ones yet, right? Like I have on my spreadsheet the ones that are like color coded. I've color coded them red for the ones that are just like very poorly reviewed by a lot of people. And I haven't hit any of those yet, right? So of the ones I've seen, these are still pretty good films, right? They're just compared to the heights that I have seen, not up there with the others.
Well, I rank both of those pretty low as well, so you're in safe company here for that.
All right.
Now, keeping it on a little bit of a negative spectrum, what was the last movie that you walked out of, or in today's streaming age, turned off?
I actually don't do that, actually. I've never walked out of a movie theater, to my knowledge, actually. And I mean, the closest is like my wife's watching a movie and I'm like half watching it, but I'm not really watching it, and then I'll leave to do something else. I don't really think that counts for that. And yeah, I mean, again, I think this comes back to me being very intentional and wanting to watch things systematically. Like I'm very rarely the type to just be, let me just put something on randomly. I usually try to pick something that I think I will probably like and self-select into that. So I've never really run into that situation, more or less. I think the two closest, the closest that I can think of, it would be maybe falling asleep in the middle of something, which may be partly because I'm just tired of when I happen to be starting to watch it. Like for example, on the flight back from LA, on my recent trip, I started watching the original All Quiet on the Western Front, because I want to do an episode and comparing it against the new one that won a lot of technical awards at the most recent Oscars. But I think I was just tired from the trip, and I just kind of just like dozed off, especially given that the style of filmmaking from the 1930s, is definitely very different than the style of filmmaking from today. So that's another one. And I think another one that maybe people might be surprised at, being the anime fan that I am, I don't think Totoro is that great of a Miyazaki film, actually, or of a film in general, actually. I have a power ranking of all of the Studio Ghibli films, and Totoro's a C tier for me, actually. Because it's definitely geared toward younger children, right? So I think that might just be part of it, where me being the age I am now, it just doesn't hit the same way for me. So it took me like 2 or 3 times to actually get through Totoro, because I was just dozing off through them every time.
That's funny, but I'm also kind of in a similar boat where if I put a movie on, I'm gonna finish it. I can only recall one movie where I put on for fun that I actively disliked it so much that I turned it off. It was some documentary, but yeah, even the stuff I dislike, which happens a lot in the death race time of the year, I still finish it out because I have to have that dopamine rush of hitting that I've watched it on Letterboxd or marking it off on one of my ballots.
Yeah, I think in general, I think part of it is just the appreciation that, as much as we attribute films are to one person or the vision of a certain person, at the end of the day, right, it's a whole industry, and there's so many dozens, if not hundreds of hands or thousands of hands that touch any individual film, that even if it's like not the best film out there, there still is I think there's some redeeming quality to all films, even if it's to the point of, you can watch a film, you didn't like it, that's fine, because at least if you watch it the whole way through, you can conclusively say, okay, this wasn't for me, right? And you can point to why it wasn't for you, and you know that to avoid stuff like that in the future. I think there's still merit to that. Now, on the flip side, when it comes to watching anime, I will drop anime. I used to be a completionist also when it comes to, if I start an anime, I'm going to finish it the entire thing. I've since come around to giving them the 3-episode rule to just drop it. If after 3 episodes, I just because there was literally like 30 or 40 anime coming out every season. So on top of watching movies and everything else, I just would not have the time. So.
Yeah. With stuff like that, where there's such a high amount of content coming out, the sunk cost fallacy rule kind of, you don't want to play into that.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so we'll start to get a little bit more positive here. What is an underrated movie, in your opinion, that more people need to see?
So, I'm going to, again, I'm going to waffle a little bit and give a couple of answers here. Tying back to the most recent question about, where I mentioned I have like a tier list of the Studio Ghibli films. I don't think this kind of also leads to the next question of the hot take, but I don't think Spirited Away is the best Ghibli film. Pause for gasping. I think that Tale of the Princess Kaguya, which is the final film of Isao Takahata, is the best Ghibli film. It's the only film in recent memory that I can actually remember tearing up to. I do not get very emotional when I watch films in general. Like, I very rarely tear up. I will laugh, and obviously I will feel emotions, but it very rarely comes to actual physical tears. I actually started physically tearing up at the end of when I was doing my Ghibli retrospective on my anime podcast, watching Tale of the Princess Kaguya. It is my S tier Ghibli film over, Spirited Away is still very good, gave it an A tier, but Tale of the Princess Kaguya has 164,000 views against Spirited Away's 1.8 million. Even, Isao Takahata's other film that he's most known for, Grave of the Fireflies, has 450,000 views on Letterboxd. So, Tale of the Princess Kaguya definitely needs, I think, a little bit more love. A lot of these films are actually all international films, but I think is somewhat to be expected. A lot of the international films tend to get overlooked somewhat. Probably the film that me and my wife together actually enjoyed the most was a Korean film called Extreme Job. Only 21,000 views on Letterboxd. So the premise is essentially there is a bunch of cops in Korea who are trying to stake out a drug lord, and so they stake out at a Korean chicken restaurant across from the hideout, and then by some circumstance they end up owning the chicken shop, basically. So they're like so this was filmed by the New York Asian Film Fest, where they had like a winter series about Asian films about food. And so this was one of those, and it was hilarious. So definitely recommend checking out Extreme Job if you can. Going back to the animated side of things, last year there was a film came out by Masaki Yuasa, who probably is, I think, the closest it comes to Satoshi Kon when it comes to like using pushing the boundary of animation for the anime industry. He had a film last year called Inu-Oh, which in my mind should have been nominated for best animated film. Obviously, it didn't. Only has 14,000 views on Letterboxd, but if you like music films, this is definitely one I think up there. And then finally, my most underrated film that I have rated at least a 4 out of 5 on Letterboxd, with the fewest, when I sorted by number of watchers. Again, another film, shout out to the New York Asian Film Fest. A couple years ago, there was a film called Still Human, which is a story about a Filipina care worker a domestic helper who works in Hong Kong, and kind of like the friendships he forms with her, kind of curmudgeonly employer, basically. So obviously it's a mix of Cantonese and Filipino, and I think it's very well done, but obviously it doesn't have that much distribution out here in the West. So very thankful for the Asian film festivals who screen that sort of thing out here. Only 1.8 thousand views on Letterboxd. So those are my 4: Tale of Princess Kaguya, Extreme Job, Inu-Oh, and Still Human.
Nice. Those are some really good picks. Some of them that I don't even know about as well either. I have to say, I want to know your opinion. Probably my favorite Ghibli and also subsequently underrated one is Only Yesterday. Where do you rank that one?
Only Yesterday. That was another Isao Takahata film, and I think that was
It
actually
was.
fairly decent. That was pretty high on my list, I think, as well. I think it might have been like a B tier for me. It's definitely, I think, there's an element of where it takes a little bit of getting used to of Isao Takahata, right? Because Isao Takahata is very much more in the realism side of things, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
he, as opposed to Miyazaki, who's very much on the on the broad, like on the fantastical side of things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Only Yesterday, I think I had it in B tier for me, actually. So definitely enjoyed that one. Though I will say I do like his Pompoko with the Tanukis. So that's
Yeah, that's
another
one I
one
haven't
as well.
seen
I
yet.
honestly, I kind of like Takahata more as a director than Miyazaki, but that's just me personally.
All right. And then, so the last question I have for you is what is an unnecessary or necessary hot take you have about a movie?
I mean, it's more about the movie industry, right? And there are a lot of takes going on around out there right now about superhero fatigue and all that, and everything, or Marvel films considered film like by Martin Scorsese and all that, or is Barbie or Nolan film votes too much or whatever, right? Versus Barbie and all that. Honestly, I think the hot take, which I don't know if it's a hot take, but the take I have is I think it would do people a lot better to realize that the movie industry is, at the end of the day, a business, right? A lot of people obviously get caught up in the romanticism of the art of movies, which I fully endorse and love the creative side of the movie industry, and how it can express something and show something and make you feel something you wouldn't otherwise, right? Like the power of movies to do that on a creative level is, and then the artistic level is makes it one of my favorite mediums out there for expressing art. Now, on the other side, though, again, it is also a business, right? And this might be my business undergrad background, maybe my revenue operation, the box office watch stuff. But I think at the end of the day, you also have to realize that it is a business, right? Like the whole Batgirl getting canceled while the Flash gets to go on and all that, right? Like, there's I think I think there is something to be said of understanding the business element for the movie industry and how it affects movies. Like, okay, we all love to dunk on Wolverine Origins, right? And how that all came up and how that's a terrible movie that kind of derailed the X-Men franchise, right? But that was during the writer's strike of 2007, 2008. And like the backstory behind how they put in Deadpool in there, the producers put the executives put him in there, but they didn't have anyone to write jokes for him. You kind of have to give it a pass for how terrible it is just because of the context of the business behind it, right? So going back to my earlier point where there's so much going on and hundreds or thousands of people touching each and every movie, like there's something to be gained from each movie. And also realizing that, when a movie doesn't do well or is released a certain way or isn't handled a certain way, there's probably a business reason for it. It's not that your movies, not to say that, box office makes them, like having a higher box office means you're a better movie than another one. That's not what I'm trying to say here. I'm just trying to say that like people will understand that. I think people should understand that there is a business element to the movie industry that goes hand in hand with art, right? I think honestly that probably makes, I think that the commercial success of movies makes it a different medium than film, than any other form of medium, right? I think, going back, right, like the success of film and the spread of film in general back to the 1920s stems from the commercialization and how it reaches a mass appeal audience. Think of that compared to, say, literature or books, right? When that first started back in the printing press days, only a handful of people in a town or even a country would be able to read those books. So that wasn't meant for the broad appeal, and that wasn't meant for the business element for that. That was probably more quote unquote pure art in that sense, right? But because the history of film and the industry of film, right, between the art and the industry are so closely tied together, I don't think you can have one without the other, unfortunately. Fortunately or unfortunately, right? So I think that's a take that people sometimes forget too often that I think needs to be reiterated more. Now, like, I mean, like right now with the Writers Guild strike going on now, this is going to affect movies for years, if not decades to come, unfortunately or unfortunately. So, I think it all comes back together, and I don't think you can have one without the other. So that's kind of like my take, I think.
I think that's a really interesting and accurate take. And it's something that I think a lot of movie fans often forget is it's a business first and foremost, unfortunately, despite how romantic we might want to get about it.
Well, I don't think it has to be unfortunately is the thing, right? Like, I like for example, right? Like I've mentioned a couple of times I'm really into Asian American issues and so on, right? Like the fact that Crazy Rich Asians had the highest opening for a romantic comedy since My Big Fat Greek Wedding proved that Asian Americans are bankable, right? Because previously, right, like no one had thought that they were really bankable. Asian American characters were kind of settled off to the side, and then, since then, you have so many Asian and Asian inspired films coming out, right? Like you have Joyride coming out, you have Everything Everywhere winning at Best Picture, right? And those films may or may not have gotten made if not for the box office success. Now, is the fact that you have to tie the success of a film to the box office, a good or bad thing? I don't think it's neither necessarily, right? I mean, it is, I think, just baked into the inherent nature of the industry. But, the fact that you can use a platform like film to lift voices of minority voices like this, even if, maybe they're not as bankable perhaps, but, there still is an element to that, right? Like, I think it's a much more nuanced conversation that we can have than what we can have here. But I don't think that tying film to commerce is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you make a film but then no one sees it, right? Like, was it ever actually seen? Like, did you have the impact you would want to have with your film if you didn't do the whole business, marketing, promotion stuff that goes along with it, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair representation of how it all works.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, that's my take.
Nice. Well, I really appreciate that. And those are the 10 Better Know a Contributor questions to ask. Paulo, thank you so much for coming on and giving me your time today.
Of course. Always glad to be on.
Now, I know you're on a bit of a hiatus right now from podcasting, but do you have plans to start them back up? And if so, what's up next for you?
Yeah, I may wait till after the 4th of July holiday here in the States, or Canada Day for you guys up north. But, I definitely plan on bringing back the Box Office Watch podcast for sure. I definitely have to catch up on all of the movies that have come out since Guardians of the Galaxy. Guardians, Spider-Verse, Flash, Fast X, Little Mermaid, kind of all the box office news from them. So that'll be coming out probably in the next couple of weeks or so. I have my anime podcast, Yet Another Anime Podcast, which I admittedly haven't been as good at keeping up with while I was on vacation, but I'm going to be kind of binging some anime also to try to give my recap of the spring anime season, and then the first impressions for the summer anime season coming up in July. And then the Oscars Death Race podcast, technically on hiatus, but I'll probably put out a couple episodes between now and the official kickoff of the season. Like I mentioned, I watched All Quiet on the Western Front to be able to compare it to the film from last year. Spoilers, I actually kind of like the newer version in a lot of ways more, though there are a lot of elements from the old version I still like more. So which is better, we'll see. And then also to some other, again, the Academy Museum gave me a lot of inspiration for movies I want to watch to maybe get up to. But, hopefully I don't burn through all the good Best Picture films before I'm left with all of the dregs when it comes toward the finishing race. So we'll see what I end up watching for the summer. And yeah, I think those are like the main ones. I also, again, have a Magic the Gathering podcast, which isn't quite as relevant for your audience probably, but that's called Into the Aether Vortex. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at in terms of podcasting. Just trying to get my groove on, back getting shaking off the vacation dust and rust, so to speak, before getting back onto the microphone.
Nice. Well, I will make sure to link to your various shows that you host in the show notes for people to check out. And this will obviously not be the last time you come on this podcast. We're already talking about something in the fall, and then, of course, in the Oscar season. And then, hopefully, if you're willing to have me back, I always enjoy coming on your show as well during Oscar season.
Of course. That is your episode until you say otherwise.
Where we predict the eventual nominees and see how well we do. That's a lot of fun to do that one. So yeah, once again, thank you so much, Paulo. I really appreciate you coming on today.
All right. Thank you, Dakota, and thanks to all your listeners as well.
Of course. This has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. Follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Contra Zoom Pod. Who would you like to see next in our Better Know a Contributor series? Send an email to contrazoompod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music, and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well, and if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.